In this video, we're going to be taking this broken 10-year-old 4-foot enclosure and turning it into this zoo quality leopard gecko setup, complete with UV lighting, naturalistic materials and live plants. And this is how we do it. Normally, with all of our other build videos on this channel, the first thing is to clean the enclosures and get them spotless. However, this one's a little bit different. We need to take some time and inspect the enclosure, see what actually needs to be fixed, and then remove the glass. We need the glass somewhere safe so that it doesn't break, and we can start making all the necessary repairs needed to this enclosure. The first piece that we want to repair is this bottom runner. To do this, we have to put the enclosure on its back, drill in some tiny little pilot holes along the side panels and from underneath into the bottom panel, and then adhere it with some extra screws. But while the enclosure is laying down on its back, we're going to take the opportunity to add in a few extra securing screws along the base. Then it's time to flip the enclosure back onto its upright position and do the same around the top. When all that's finished and secured, it's time to start building the inbuilt moist hide and egg laying box that we are going to build into this enclosure. To do this, we have to choose what size container we're going to be using for our moist hide. Then we lay the moist hide container onto a piece of wood, marking out the size of the container, both the floor space and the sides, adding a little bit extra just for a bit of movement within the wood. And once the pieces are all cut out, it's time to start taking the very top piece. We want to have a big entrance hole so the gecko can get into the moist hide, and we're going to be drilling some holes over this side to allow for a little bit of drainage for one of the plants. Then we start putting all the pieces together, adding silicone as extra security and screws to add lifelong longevity. While we're allowing that silicone to cure for the acquired time, it's time to start putting a hole in the side of the enclosure. To do this, we have to measure the height and the depth of the box that we're going to be putting in place and cutting out accordingly. Top tip here is to measure twice and cut once. If you do cut too big, you can't go back and repair it. But now it's time to seal off the entire enclosure. To do this, we're using clear 100% silicone, and we're running it across every single corner within the enclosure, just to add a little bit of water resistance, because there will be a slight little bit of water within this enclosure every now and then. We left that to cure for the acquired time. Now the next step would normally be do the background and the side panels. However, the UK has gone into a month-long second wave lockdown, so we can't get to the hardware store to pick up some of the stuff that we do need to build the background. However, I do have some of the stuff to do the floor, so that's what we're going to do next. The first step is to plan out where the plants are going to go. We're going to put the original hide back in that we did make. If you want to see a video on how we made that, just click on the card directly above now. We're going to add a dried up riverbed into this enclosure as well, so we need to plan where that goes, and then we can start getting some expanding foam and spraying the areas that need it the most. We're going to be spraying areas along the sides of the riverbank. We're going to be putting the hide in place with expanding foam. We're going to be making plant pots or plant surroundings using the expanding foam, and then leave it to dry for the acquired time. Once the expanding foam has cured and expanded fully, it's time to start carving our desired design into the foam. To do this, we're going to need two products, a sharp knife and a razor scraper. We need to make sure every single shiny surface is off the expanding foam. Unfortunately, it does dry shiny, and for the next process to adhere to the foam, we need to make sure every shiny surface is off. This is also the time where you can carve out your planting areas, any caves that you might want carving into the foam, along with various other aspects. This can be quite time consuming, messy and tedious, but the reward when it's finished well outweighs how much effort you put into it. Now it's time for the messy part. We have to turn this expanding foam into something a little bit closer to a leopard gecko's natural habitat. We're going to be creating a solid floor for these leopard geckos. To do that, we've got this plaster of Paris. This plaster of Paris turns out grey. We're going to be mixing it up 2.5 parts plaster powder to 1/2 part cold water. First, we need to clean the whole enclosure just to make sure there's no loose debris or dust kicking around on any of the foam. Then we have to spray the foam down so it's slightly damp, just to help the plaster adhere to the foam much more easily. And then we grab cupfuls of the plaster and pour it over various aspects of the foam, slowly spreading it out, creating a nice even layer throughout the whole enclosure. We want to make sure we get inside all the hides, in all the little nooks and crannies, inside the dried riverbed, and inside all the plant pots. Now this plaster only takes an hour to cure, so around about 40 minutes into the curing process, we like to sprinkle a little bit of sand over the top of it, slightly damp sand, just to see if it will adhere onto the surface and give us a nice sandy texture. We'll have to wait until it fully cures to see if that has worked. But when it has cured, we get a little soft brush and brush off all of the excess sand into the dry riverbed. We then scoop it up and put it into our bucket for safekeeping for further use later on. Now it's time to start laying our slate. We've got a wide array of different shapes and sizes of slate. This all came off a Welsh mountain, and fun fact, when I was there filming, I actually slipped. I hope you giggled at that footage. We're going to start placing the slate in various ways where the leopard gecko can get closer to the UV lighting, get closer to the heat, have loads of hides, and use the slate where it's most likely to be used. To do this, we add silicone onto all of the contact points where the slate meets the slate, or where the slate meets the hardscape that's already in place. We have to make sure it's secure, so no time in the future is this going to fall and potentially injure one of the animals. Any silicone residue that is left over that is visible to the eye, we like to cover it in sand, let it cure overnight, and then brush it off. We do this exact same process throughout the entire enclosure, with the idea of having different heights, different structures, everything to aid the leopard gecko's naturalistic environment, to help him get closer to the UV rays and to also help him hide away from the UV rays. This slate, the natural material, is highly important. We will be doing more throughout the background as soon as the hardware shops are open and we can pick up the materials for the background. We want to add in as much natural slate as possible for many different reasons. One, it can help trim down their claws. Two, the wavelengths of light that come off the UV lighting that we are using in this enclosure will alter or be reabsorbed into the natural materials, giving out a different wavelength of light, just like the animals would naturally see in the wild. Natural materials are just beneficial all round. Once the silicone has been left overnight to cure, it's time to grab our soft brush once again and brush off all of the excess sand, brush it into the dried riverbeds and remove it accordingly. While we're doing that, let me quickly introduce myself. My name's Richard, this channel's called Northern Exotics. On this YouTube channel we talk all things reptile related, whether it be specific species care, build videos like you're seeing right now, reptile life hacks. If there is any new information that comes out, whether it be scientific or technologically advanced, we'll bring it straight to you. We're normally the first person to get it out onto YouTube. If it is something you're interested in, I'd really appreciate it if you did help us reach our goal of 100,000 subscribers. With your help, I'm sure we can do it. But back to the build in hand. We actually found some styrofoam kicking around in the reptile room. It's not enough, but it's enough to make a good start on the background. For this step, you're going to need a lighter, a sharp knife, possibly a razor scraper, and a pair of sharp scissors. To do this, we're going to be cutting up the styrofoam into various shapes that look like rock faces. First thing is to get the vents that are already in the enclosure out of the enclosure, lay them down onto the styrofoam and draw around them and cut that shape around them. Secure the vents into the styrofoam using silicone sealants and cut a shape out that looks vaguely like a rock. We're going to grab a lighter and run a lighter over the styrofoam very lightly, very quickly. Be warned, this is a fire risk, so take it very easily. But doing this is going to create a rock formation on the styrofoam. We're then going to silicone the styrofoam to the background. We're going to keep the corners of the styrofoam to actually use in the corners of the background. Again, with this process you can get quite creative. I'm going to start making some grooves within the actual rock faces, just to look like it's a damaged rock that would naturally be seen in the wild. This is again one of those tasks that can be quite time consuming and tedious, but it's well worth it in the end. It might be worth at this stage to start planning out if you're going to have any hygrometers or thermometers built into the background, just like I have with my bearded dragon Diego. For me here, I've just got this one hygrometer in the middle of the enclosure and I'm going to have to work around it. It was at this point, halfway through the background build, that we'd already broken 2 lighters. It was time to come up with a much more sustainable plan. That's where this little torch come in extremely handy. For $5 off Amazon, it is linked in the description down below. This should save us a lot of trouble. A little top tip for the design aspect of it: if you have a big piece of rock on the back wall meeting a corner, the piece on the side wall that meets that big piece should only be a small piece. It just adds to the aesthetic appeal of the whole design. For the design aspect, it's also worth keeping in mind not to just stick to big pieces on the background. Yes, it does fill up the background rather quickly. However, if you add smaller pieces in all the gaps, it just adds to the contrast, making the background a lot more aesthetically pleasing. The next part of this build, we're going to move over to the moist hide area of the enclosure. We get the original piece of wood that we did cut out of the side of the enclosure, attach a hinge onto one side, then attach the hinge to the inside of the opening. Make sure it still fits and works perfectly fine. Then attach the locking mechanism to the enclosure and the door so that it does stay nice and secure, so little hands can't get in there when they're not wanted. This allows us access to the moist hide, which is also going to be used as an egg laying box when it comes round to breeding season. Now, we can't just leave the background as a bare polystyrene or a painted polystyrene simply because there's going to be some heat inside this enclosure. We don't want the background to melt or suffer from any sort of fire risk. That's where this substance comes in. This is just a plaster substance similar to the stuff we used for the floor of the enclosure. We have to masking tape off the entire floor of the enclosure so none of it does drip onto the enclosure. So once the floor is masking taped off and covered up with newspaper, it's time to start mixing up the plaster once again. 2.5 parts powder to 1 part water. In this scenario, I'm going to make it a little bit more watery just to make it spread a lot more easier and hope it doesn't drip as much. It's time to gently start brushing it on all the surfaces, all the sides, the background. This can be again quite tedious and it does take some time to dry. Now, that may need a couple of coats to get the desired effect. You can even add in some acrylic paint into the mixture to give the background a nice little colour. We then get our razor scraper and clean up all of the edges, clean the excess up from up on top of all of the vents. Just generally tidy up the excess. Peel back all of the masking tape, remove all the newspaper and admire your work. If you do find any areas that need to be touched up, feel free to give it a dab of paint like I have. We used sand coloured acrylic paint. We still need the hardware shop so that we can do the exterior of this enclosure. So while we're waiting for them to open, we can start working on the heating and lighting side of things. But first, have you got a baby leopard gecko? What name have you named it? I'm always curious to see the funny little names that we give to our baby leopard geckos. This one is mine and she's called Millie. But the lighting we're going to use, for the UV lighting, we're going to use the Reptile Systems Eco T5 unit, Zone 1. Zone 1 is where a leopard gecko would fit on the Ferguson scale, so a Zone 1 light would be absolutely perfect for this enclosure. All we have to do is secure these brackets to the ceiling of the enclosure with securing screws, clip the unit in place and feed the wire out the back and plug it in. For the heating side of things, we're going to use the Mega Ray infrared heat projector. This projects an infrared ray of infrared A and infrared B, meaning the infrared wavelengths will penetrate deeply into the tissue of the animal, warming the animal from the inside, just like the animal would naturally see in the wild. Whereas a heat mat or a ceramic heat emitter won't do that. We have to put a small hole in the back of the enclosure underneath the hot side for the thermostat probe, and then turn everything on to test it. We set the thermostat to 32 degrees Celsius, that's 90 degrees Fahrenheit. We set the UVI timer onto 12 hours on, 12 hours off. The next step is going to be our substrate and planting. We're going to add some substrate, a thin, compact layer underneath the main hide. We're going to add some more underneath this central hide and more in the dried riverbed. If you do want to find out more about our substrate and all about the substrate layers, which is vitally important, please click on the card that's shown directly above now. But to plant this enclosure, we've got this big succulent that's going to go in the dry riverbed. We've got these arid grass species. These are the same arid grass species that we do have in our Savannah Monitors enclosure, and they're thriving in there with the substrate that we do use, so why not use it in here? After all, leopard geckos do come from scrublands. We're going to add some more arid grass up here, And we've got all of these little tiny succulents to add as little accent pieces throughout the enclosure. Now it's at this point we would normally get onto the exterior of the enclosure, but again, due to lockdown, all the hardware shops are closed. So we're going to save that for a future video, so make sure you hit subscribe for that one. So what we're going to do now, we're going to install the moist hide into the enclosure. We're going to clean the glass and put the glass back in the enclosure. Sit back and wait for a week just to make sure the temperatures are perfect, make sure the humidity is perfect. Add in some springtails around some of the plants just to allow for a little bit of a cleanup crew within the enclosure. Add leopard gecko into the enclosure. Sit back, relax, and watch your leopard gecko's naturalistic behaviours come out inside her naturalistic enclosure. I hope you have enjoyed the video. If you have, please consider liking. If you're new around here, I'd really appreciate it if you did hit that subscribe button. Peace out.